Hi, in this video I am showing you how I built this coat rack, made of walnut and brass. In the joinery of this furniture piece I am using knife making technique where I sandwich a brass sheet between wood and insert brass pins to hold it together. So join me on this build that turned out to be quite tricky and time consuming, but in the end it all came out to be totally worth it. So I started out with cutting the glued walnut panel because I couldn't find walnut lumber that was thick or long enough that I could mill it myself. It did end up costing a bit more, but I was using only about 6 strips from this board and most of it was left over, so I can use it in a future build. This panel was already 30 millimeters thick, so I only needed to cut about 6 30mm wide strips to get all the material that I needed. For these cuts I used my Festool TKS80 panel saw that I am very impressed with, because it is really precise and super easy to use. Plus it has a saw stop system that also makes it really safe. Then I started to cut an 11-degree angle to one end of all the pieces. The upper ends of the top pieces I left at a 90-degree angle. For the center parts I used an MDF template that I made earlier. I marked it out on the two pieces and cut them roughly to size. I decided to cut the excess material off so it would be easier on the router table. Then I had made a jig where I could clamp down the piece using double-sided tape and couple of screws, so it would hold it firmly in place. I am using my router table that I had built earlier. The build video of this table is on my channel, so if you are interested how I made this, go and have a look. The router is CMT7E. It is pretty basic, but it is very powerful. It has a 2.4 kilowatt motor, and right now it is good enough for me. I used a flush trim router bit with insert knives that leaves a very smooth finish, and on this walnut it worked perfectly. Here I am cutting out the slots for the half-lapping joint to put the two center pieces together. For the bottom joint I had to make this tricky cut on the panel saw that I couldn't make on the miter saw. I know I should have made a proper jig for this cut so it would be more sturdy and safe, but I had to chisel it out anyway, so I went with that. Here I put an 11-degree angle on the saw and made the cuts. Because the cuts weren't precise enough, I chiseled these out to be absolutely perfect, and I wouldn't have any problems when I was going to glue these together. Here I am marking out the inner radius for the bottom parts of the legs. I am using the Makita track saw and the panel saw to cut the ends off, and also a Japanese pull saw. Then I went over to the spindle sander to get the inner radius sanded. And just like before, I am cutting out slots for the base to make a half-lapping joint. Here I had made a small error before because the angle was too big, but nothing too major. I just had to cut the ends to a smaller degree angle. So I tried the joint together and it fits perfectly. I put the base together and sanded the burn marks out, because the blade of the track saw was getting a bit dull. Here I am using a jig that I had made earlier, so I could cut the slots for the brass sheet. I used film-faced plywood to sandwich the blade of the Japanese pull saw in the center of the detail. I figured that it would be better to use a jig because I was afraid that when I would freehand the cut it wouldn't be precise enough. It took a lot of time and effort to sew it by hand because I had to make 16 of these cuts. But in the end I was pleased with the result because the cuts were perfectly in the center and they were absolutely identical. I had to use the Japanese saw because it has a thickness of 0.5 millimeters, exactly the same as the brass sheet that I will be using. Here I am roughly cutting out the shape of the brass detail. It also took a long time, but later on I found out that using tin snips would be much easier. Then it was time to glue these joints together. I am using clear epoxy glue and using a box cutter blade to get the glue inside the slots. It was surprisingly easy to get the brass sheet in between. Then I put the three pieces together, made sure that they aligned perfectly and later clamped them down. When the glue had dried, I used a jig with a 90-degree hole to drill out the holes for the brass pins. Then used the file to get rid of the overlap of the brass sheet, so later on I could go on the spindle sander and the brass wouldn't tear up the sanding paper. Very carefully sanded the edges nice and flush. Again I used epoxy glue in the holes and hammered in 6mm diameter brass pins to hold the joint firmly together. Use the same method to glue the bottom joints together. Put some clamps on to hold it down with enough pressure. I cut the pins a bit longer than the thickness of the material, so later I could file them down. I had 8 of these joints to put together, so it took a lot of time to wait for the glue to dry, because I couldn't glue them together all at the same time. When the first loop of the coat rack was glued, I had left one joint open in the second one so I could slide one inside the other and fix them with the half-lap joints. Then glued the last parts together. Next part was to sand all the glue residue off, so I could have a clean surface to router the edges. I used a Makita router with a bit with 12.7 mm radius. I left the brass pins further away enough so that I wouldn't hit them with the router bit. This Makita router has to be one of the most inconvenient ones that I have ever used. For me it's not ergonomical, and the worst part was that the suction port constantly came loose and made it a bit dangerous. So I decided to ditch the vacuum cleaner so I wouldn't ruin the piece. Then I sanded it all down with 120, 180, 240 and 320 sanding papers. Next step was to drill the holes for the brass pins that would be the hooks where you could hang your clothes to. I used a jig with a 15-degree hole, fixed it with a couple of clamps and drilled 2 holes on every side. Then used epoxy and hammered the brass pins inside. Hand sanded all the edges smooth. Made holes and screwed in a threaded insert so I could use 2 bolts to hold the parts together. For the bottom I used the same threaded inserts and bolts that would work as legs. So when the floor wasn't level enough you could still make the coat rack stand sturdy on the ground. For the final step I used satin clear coat. Usually I use wood oils like Rubio Monocoat or Osmo, but in this case I had to use clear coat because wood oils don't penetrate brass and it would oxidize and change color over time. When the first coat was dry, I sanded it down with a very fine sanding pad and gave it the second coat. I am very pleased with the final result. I love how European walnut and brass look together, and the sandwiching of the metal between the wood made the joints super strong, so you could hang even very heavy clothes on the rack and the joints wouldn't break over time. Thanks for watching this video. If you have enjoyed it, please like, subscribe and leave a comment so I could keep making these cool build videos.